In today's world of instantaneous information and a news media predicated on sensationalist headlines to feed the ever-growing profit-first business models, we see increasingly outrageous and grotesque crimes, from the destruction of iconic landmarks and monuments to celebrity sex trafficking. The talking heads on TV and even our politicians tell us how these monsters must be taken off the streets and locked away for our safety and for justice. And with such a high volume of these outrageous crimes plaguing our news feeds every day, it's hard not to simply think locking these criminals up is the right decision. But before we go locking up every criminal we catch, we should stop and think, what is the purpose of prisons in our society? Is it for retribution, inflicting suffering on somebody as a way of punishment? Deterrence, using the threat of punishment to stop the opportunists in our society? Rehabilitation, fixing those we believe are unable to function in our society as we want them to? Or is it simply social protection, to take the bad people out of our society for the good of the many? Before getting caught up in criminal justice philosophy, we should first look at where the idea of prisons came from. Before the 17th century, punishment was overwhelmingly corporeal or capital. Common sanctions included stocks, branding, floggings, and mutilation. Lesser offenders might be forced into indentured servitude, with the most serious crimes, treason, murder, heresy, carrying the death penalty. As civilization moved into the 18th century, Enlightenment ideas began to challenge indiscriminate violence. Many European states turned to transportation. Convicts were shipped to the penal colonies, most famously North America, and, after 1788, Australia, where they endured grueling and agricultural or construction work. Accommodation was minimal, often old ships or makeshift camps, and disease and high mortality rates were rampant. By the late 18th century and early 19th century, reformers such as John Howard and Beccaria argued that crime stemmed from social conditions, not simple moral failings. Prisons with purpose began to emerge as state-run institutions, having secure buildings with designated cell blocks and permanent guards. These new prisons were run with philosophical foundations influenced by the Quakers and evangelical Christians. The goal of these new institutions became aimed at instilling contemplation, piety, and moral reform. Coming into the late 19th century, the lofty goals of reform gave way to overcrowding, underfunding, and punitive policies. Prisons became warehouses of the poor and marginalized. And finally, the 20th and 21st century ushers in a wave of deinstitutionalization and tough-on-crime stances, but also, especially as we move to our current day status quo, a revival of rehabilitation-focused models, such as restorative justice programs, and alternative punishment like probation and community service. Looking at the history, we can see that society's development of criminal justice systems that include prisons is a rather new concept that came with the development of liberal ideals. So, what were the ideals and philosophies that conceptualized the modern criminal justice system? Our first philosopher is Beccaria, a brilliant 18th century European thinker. For Beccaria, the criminal justice system was part of the social contract made between citizen and government. He believed that man would give up part of his freedom for the security provided by the state. Beccaria believed that the principal means of enforcing the social contract between the state and its citizen was through the penal system, in which the state would prevent individuals from the reclamation of their sacrificed freedom using punishment. As the penal system was part of the state's contract with its citizens, there was a limitation on the amount the state could legally punish the citizen. This was succinctly phrased by Beccaria as the minimum possible under the circumstances. The right to punish, from the perspective of Beccaria, is limited to what is absolutely necessary to defend the public well-being. Any punishment that goes beyond the need to preserve this bond between state and citizen is unjust by its very nature. At the same time, Beccaria was explicit that punishment needs to fit the crime, with the harm of the crime being measured by the damage done to society, not by the intent of the perpetrator. On these grounds, Beccaria stated that the proper amount of punishment is related to what is necessary to prevent future similar acts of criminality. The purpose of punishment is to solve for the future, not to try and undo damage rendered, stating in his book on crimes and punishment, "The wailing of a wretch cannot undo what has been done and turn back the clock." This is to say, there is no way to undo harm. The purpose of punishment to Beccaria is nothing other than to prevent the offender from doing fresh harm to his fellows and to deter others from doing likewise. The other important aspect of Beccaria's penal philosophy, as mentioned earlier, is that of proportionality of punishment. The punishment should, as far as possible, fit the nature of the crime. Beccaria believed that the proportionality helped draw a connection between the crime and the punishment. If I commit this crime, I can expect to be punished in this way. This, he adds, serves admirably to draw even closer the important connection between a misdeed and its punishment. Beccaria proposes creating a scale of wrong actions and a corresponding scale of punishments, running from the harshest to the mildest, and then suggests that if there were an exact and universal scale of crimes and punishments, we should have an approximate and common measure of the gradation of tyranny and liberty, and the basic humanity and evil of the different nations. Our next philosopher is Bentham, a key thinker in utilitarian thought. Bentham was a self-proclaimed hedonist, believing only in the material world and the human body's sensations, stating that the only thing we can know for certain is that which can be observed and verified. He argued that the legal sciences should be built based on the idea that only the physical sensation and experience mattered. Things like theology should be excluded from the purview of legal thought. Bentham offered the famous declaration that underscores the primacy of pains and pleasures in utilitarian theory. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, the chain of causes and effects, are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjugation will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In other words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality, he will remain subject to it all the while. The principle of utility recognizes the subjugation and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and law. This passage expresses two important theses of Bentham's philosophy. Human conduct is a matter of fact, is governed by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. The standard of right and wrong is fixed by reference to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. Thus, anticipated pleasure and pains supplies both the motive that actually moves us and the criterion for appraising actions, institutions, and laws. We can judge an action and law based on their tendency to increase the net balance of pleasure over pain. This is utility. As each person's happiness makes up society's aggregate pleasure and pain, it is up to the legislator, judges, and moral actors to maximize pleasure and minimize pain in the societal aggregate. That means each decision made should aim to bring as many people as possible pleasure while minimizing the pain. For example, if someone commits murder, they have caused the individual they murdered pain by taking their life, and caused society pain by subjecting it to danger and terror. By imprisoning the criminal, you have caused him pain, but you have brought society pleasure by removing a threat from the community, enforcing social order, and protecting future victims from suffering further pain in the form of murder or bodily harm. So, the aggregate pleasure outweighs the aggregate pain. Bentham's philosophy was focused on the idea of consequences of an act, holding no credence to the motive of the crime. The utility of an act is either good or bad, determined solely by the consequences of the action. When deciding whether to act or which act to undertake, a person must calculate as best as they can the pains and pleasures that may reasonably be expected to occur to the persons affected by the acts under consideration. A similar calculation should guide the legislator in forming laws. Bentham, as with Beccaria, also acknowledged the importance of proportional punishment. To this end, he developed rules to guide the lawmakers in the construction of a penal code, including the elements involved in the calculation of mischief caused by an offence and the appropriate punishment. As part of Bentham's argument for proportional punishment, he alluded to the idea of marginal utility. He used this to describe how punishments need to be tailored to the offender. For example, having to pay a fine for a rich person has a diminished effect on the pain it causes, as the fine is very easily payable, whilst for a poor person that fine would be comparatively very painful. So, Bentham encourages lawmakers to ensure their punishments are proportionately painful for the offender. Now we move to the philosophy of deserts, championed by Kant. Kant's foundational belief is that humans are rational, thinking beings, able to make autonomous moral decisions. From this position, he conceptualized an idea of what a truly moral action is, and derived that the only truly good thing is goodwill. This is the human desire to do something good for the sake of being good. This, he considered, was an act from duty to fellow man. After conceptualizing the idea of acting from duty, Kant came to the idea of categorical imperative. This is the idea that you should only act on rules that you would be comfortable with everyone acting out. E.g., do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. I ought never to act except in such a way that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. Because of Kant's belief in self-governance of human nature, he concluded that a human can never merely be treated as a means, but instead always as an end. This means you should not use someone as a mean or a tool through the use of deception, coercion, or exploitation to achieve something. This robs that person of their rational agency. You must give them the dignity to act in their own right, be the master of their own destiny. It is by this logic that Kant came to the position of the rejection of rehabilitative or deterrative punishment. As both of these forms of punishment, Kant considered, subverted the rational human's agency and the right to govern himself, and instead used him as a means for social cohesion. An additional part of Kant's concern to this type of forward-looking punishment was the idea that the state could end up punishing the innocent in an attempt to deter future criminals. Imagine that the population of a community believes that John Doe has committed a horrendous crime, even though he has not. The state knows that John Doe is innocent, but they don't know who actually committed the crime. So, the state punishes John Doe. This deters other people within the community from committing similar crimes, reducing public unrest about the unsolved crime and increases the public's sense of safety. So with forward-looking punishment, such as rehabilitation and deterrence excluded, this leaves Kant with only one other remaining position: retributive punishment. Kant goes further still with his belief in retributive justice, arguing that a criminal should never receive a change in the severity of his punishment. For example, a criminal could not offer to rat out other criminals in exchange for leniency. His concern was that justice would become perverted and irrational, as those who are punished to the full extent of the law would become resentful of those who got off easy. And even those who have not committed a crime would feel as if though they have been unjustly served by these cases. The final part of Kant's justice philosophy was proportional punishment. The punishment should always be proportional to the crime. Interestingly, he came to a similar conclusion to that of Bentham on marginal utility of punishment. If a rich man commits a crime and the punishment is a fine, the punishment is not proportionate to that of a poor man committing the same crime. So, you instead have to find an alternative way to equally punish the rich man. Our final philosopher is a proponent of rehabilitation, Anthony Duff. For Duff, the penal system needs to be thought of from a dual perspective. From a societal perspective, something that we do upon criminals, and from a criminal's perspective, something they undertake to reform. Duff argues that if a wrongdoer takes serious notice of his own wrongdoing, this will make a difference to his future conduct. The offender will see that he must respond to what he has done, and the response must be directed at the victim of his wrongdoing. Second, he will determine that he must avoid conducting the criminal action in the future and address the circumstances that caused and facilitated the wrongdoing. This, Duff argues, is linking the responsibility to the crime. For example, when I have done wrong, I must take responsibility for the wrong, which involves recognizing and responding to it. Taking responsibility for my actions is connected to being held responsible for them by others. In holding others responsible for their actions, in calling for them to account or to answer for those actions, we try and bring them to take responsibility for those actions. Duff seems to have a similar philosophical approach to that of Kant, believing that this action of taking moral responsibility is not a utilitarian requirement, but an acknowledgement of the offender as a responsible agent, required to identify their wrongdoings. Having the offender take this responsibility is not only to the benefit of the victim of the crime, but also to the requirement of treating offenders not as a social outgroup, but as a member of society. Duff anguishes over how the justice system treats offenders as outsiders to society, acting as if they have now forfeited their civic standing. Duff does not imply that offenders don't sometimes need to be removed from society and put in prison, as sometimes this is required, but instead saying, I can only assert that I take to be a fundamental principle of a decent society, that it treats all its members, including those who have committed criminal wrongs, with equal concern and respect. Concern is for their well-being, while respect is for their status as responsible citizens. If we take this principle seriously, our collective response to wrongs must aim still to treat their perpetrators with the appropriate concern and respect. Now, the more practical of those of you watching will be wondering, what is the most effective penal system? My 2 points of comparison will be the United States versus Norway. The United States representing a system more focused on retribution, and Norway representing a system focused on rehabilitation. Whilst I'm only comparing these two justice systems, think about where your country sits in the spectrum between these two justice systems, and what you can learn from either. If we try to map a philosophy onto the US penal system, it would be that of a retributive system, somewhat reminiscent of Kant's emphasis on desert. The United States system is quite punitive in nature. This is evidenced by the colossal prison population. The US has about 5% of the world's population, yet houses 20% of the world's incarcerated persons. Per capita, this is roughly 600 people per 100,000. This is multiple times higher than the rest of the Western developed world. Worse still for the US penal system is the recidivism rate. This is the rate at which prisoners reoffend. The Federal Bureau of Justice Statistics found that 66% of released state prisoners were rearrested within 3 years, and 82% were arrested at least once during a 10-year follow-up. There have been attempts to lower this recidivism rate in the US, the most successful being the education of inmates. Inmates who participated in the correctional education programs had a 43% lower odds of recidivism than those who did not. This translates to a reduction in the risk of recidivism of 13 percentage points. It also drove better out-of-prison outcomes for those who participated in correctional education, with a study showing the odds of obtaining employment post-release among inmates who participated in correctional education was 13% higher than the odds of those who did not. Finding employment after prison is especially important, as felons are ineligible for welfare in most states and are not eligible for subsidised housing for at least 2 years after release. This lack of assistance, reintegrating into society, contributes to creating a second class of citizen who are largely excluded from law-abiding communities, meaning a lack of real opportunity for these people. Ultimately, this leads to people who don't care for the country or communities, as they have no reason to buy into society. Why should these people care about the safety, cohesion, and cleanliness of a community that has no interest in their well-being? While thinking about the United States justice system, it is also important to consider the conditions that prisoners are subjected to as part of their punishment. Remember, for punishment to be considered just, according to all 4 philosophers we looked at, it needs to be proportionate. This idea of proportionality is even alluded to in the US Constitution through the 8th Amendment. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. And a series of Supreme Court cases has further enshrined this philosophy. Estelle v. Gamble. Deliberate indifference to serious medical needs violates the 8th Amendment. Farmer v. Brennan. Prison officials must protect inmates from substantial risk of serious harm. Helling v. McKinney. Exposure to environmental hazards can be unconstitutional. But does the US penal system live up to this ideal? A quick look at the stats will show the grim reality of a prisoner's life. Prison-based physical victimization is as high as 20%, according to the National Library of Medicine. Of that 20% of physical victimization, we can see a concerningly high level of sexual victimization, with the National Library of Medicine saying that sexual abuse ranges from 3.7 to 12% of the total incarcerated population. Now, looking at the facilities that house these prison populations, we can see another serious cause for concern. Looking to Florida, in 2023, the state contracted KPMG to conduct a strategic plan report on prisons. It identified 3 key areas of concern. First, infrastructure deterioration, leaking roofs, lacking of air conditioning, corroded doors, insufficient plumbing, broken windows, and crumbling infrastructure, all compromising safety and security. Second, lack of available care for an aging, incarcerated population. And third, the financial burden related to staffing and maintaining the facility. These issues are not exclusive to Florida though. In 2024, Politico released an article exploring the prison facilities across the southern states. The report focused on the lack of appropriate cooling to handle the growing severity of the heat waves, finding that approximately 13% of deaths behind bars in Texas during the warm months may be attributed to extreme heat, and that the lack of reprieve from the heat can increase violent interactions in prisons by 20%. High temperatures also correlate with a 30% increase in daily suicide watch incidents. When people incarcerated in the Mississippi Delta sued over the sweltering summer temperatures in their cells, the US Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit reminded them that the Constitution does not mandate comfortable prisons, citing prior Supreme Court cases. The court downplayed the severity of the heat that the prisoners were suffering through and suggested they wear less clothing and use the sink with cold running water. Attempts to have the air conditioning installed in the prison have been met with a total lack of sympathy for the incarcerated. Recently, efforts in both Texas and Florida to allocate major funding to address this issue have been sputtered due to resistance from lawmakers. This has led to the majority of facilities remaining without ACs, As of 2024, roughly 3/4 of the Florida prisons and 2/3 of the Texas prisons lack air conditioning. Both inmates and prison guards say that the sweltering conditions are not only inhumane, but make the facility much more dangerous for everyone. One Texas inmate filed the lawsuit in federal court against the Texas Department of Criminal Justice after suffering what was most likely a stroke due to heat. The lawsuit references inmates drinking toilet water to cool off and temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit inside the prison.
He said they take their shirts or their sheets at night and put them in the toilet so that they can get them wet and then lay in them.
But this summer,
The complaint put it best: if cooking someone to death does not amount to cruel and unusual punishment, then nothing does. The US justice system clearly has a strong affinity towards punishment as a consequence of crime. But the stats show that the United States system is not effective. There is an incredibly high incarcerated population with a very high probability of reoffending. This criminal class becomes unable to reintegrate into society and turn their lives around. A part of the reason for this is the justice system's failure to proportionately and fairly distribute justice. A cornerstone of the US justice system is that the punishment should fit the crime. When we think about the conditions that the incarcerated are subjected to in the United States and the abuse that they suffer whilst locked away in prison, can we consider the punishment having matched the crime? Is 1 in 5 prisoners being victimized in a violent way justice? Is 1 in 10 prisoners being raped or sexually victimized in another way justice? Is suffering and dying in the sweltering heat with little to no reprieve justice? How can you expect a prisoner, once released from these conditions, to have any stake in the society that subjected them to that type of suffering? It is little wonder that so many go on to reoffend. If we consider these outcomes unjust and believe in the ideals of proportionate punishment or justice, then it behooves us to demand better for this segment of society. While the US government does not mandate all of these abusive results, it seemingly does little to prevent them, as seen by the refusal to improve the facilities, and thus accepts them as an unofficial consequence of the punishment for crime. Looking now to Norway, we see a system that is vastly different to that of the USA. Norway's criminal justice system focuses on the principles of restorative justice and rehabilitation of prisoners. The focus for Norway is aligned with that of the philosopher R.A. Duff, focusing not only on society within the justice system, but also the offender, and working on making them a functioning member of society. Norway has a per capita prison population of about 58 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants. The goal of punishment in Norway is solely to restrict liberty, with the prisoner, retaining all of their other rights, such as the right to vote, ensuring that they are still represented and protected within the democratic process. Norway also boasts one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world, with only 20% of Norway's formerly incarcerated population committing another crime within 2 years of release. Even after 5 years, the recidivism rate is only 25%. Part of the reason Norway's recidivism rate is so low is the state's use of community integration through the Penalties in Society initiative, allowing offenders that are deemed safe and that don't impose a burden on the victim and society to serve at least some of their time out of jail, meeting regularly with an official instead. This allows the offender to retain their current employment or find court-ordered employment, and they may remain with their families and continue their normal life. This helps facilitate a community connection and ensures the offender has a stake in the safety and future of their community. Prison conditions are also vastly different to their United States counterpart. In Norway, as mentioned above, prison's sole purpose of punishment is to restrict liberty. So prisoners are given a lot of freedom within the prison, such as individual access to computers and the internet, both in classrooms and in their cells. They also have access to workshops for woodworking and the like. This level of freedom even exists in the ultra-high security prison of Skien, which holds the most dangerous criminals in the country. Less high-security prisons in Norway, such as Bastøy, offer even greater freedoms, allowing recreational activities such as fishing and swimming at the island's beaches. Now, of course, the comparison to the US is not entirely fair. Norway is a very small country and has a far more cohesive population and a stronger welfare state. However, this does not mean that the US has nothing to learn from the restorative Norwegian systems. Now, to be fair, not all is perfect in Norway. They still suffer issues of prisoner suicide. The World Health Organization has also criticized the fact that the rate of suicide in the Norwegian prisons is one of the highest in Europe. Though, this could have to do with Norway's selective incarceration policy, which targets those already at much higher risk of suicide, such as violent offenders and habitual drug users. The final question to investigate is a utilitarian question, and that is the cost of the penal system. The US has two categories of prisons, federal and state. On average, a state prison costs around $65,000 per inmate per year, though this does vary dramatically state to state. The federal prisons cost around $44,000 per inmate per year. Now, looking at the Norwegian system, it is costed slightly differently. It is costed at a capacity rather than a per inmate system, but we can still see it is quite a bit more expensive as a penal system, with high security prisons costing around $123 per bed per capacity, and lower security prisons costing around $88,000 per bed. But these costs only capture a piece of the total cost of the penal system. Another cost that needs to be considered is the cost of lost tax revenue. How much would the state have made had the inmate not been incarcerated and was instead gainfully employed? To apply this to the Norwegians, the average Norwegian annual income tax payment is equivalent to $17,000, and the average sales tax per person per year is around $6,300. They currently have 58 inmates per 100,000 in prison, so with this per capita prison population, Norway loses an estimated $1.3 million of tax revenue. If Norway had the equivalent US incarceration rate of 600 inmates per 100,000 people, it would equate to an estimated tax revenue loss of $13.9 million. Using these numbers, we can see a per capita opportunity tax revenue savings of $12.6 million. This roughly equates to a Norway nationwide tax revenue saving or additional earning of $630 million. That's the entire prison system cost in Norway. Assuming the same calculation method as above, the US is currently losing nearly $20 billion a year in tax revenue from an unproductive, incarcerated class of people. If the US was to get their per capita incarceration rate down to 58 inmates per 100,000 people, they would unlock over $17 billion in tax revenue. Now, it's important to note this assumes each prisoner would earn an average wage in their respective country. Realistically, people in prison come from lower socioeconomic areas, so for a true calculation, a lot more variables would need to be considered. But this still shows a very rough baseline of the other costs that need to be considered when looking at a penal system. So when considering the justice and penal system, we have a vast array of philosophical thinkers to pull from. But if there's one thing that all of the philosophers that we covered in this video agreed on, it's the importance of proportionality. That's not to say that there aren't fringe ideas of deterrative justice, but they are not the mainstream, and for good reason. Punishment needs to be just. And a just system treats people as citizens, not as scapegoats, or as Kant would say, a means to an end. Personally, I believe in a rehabilitative approach. We shouldn't treat offenders as some kind of social outgroup, but as members of our community who are in need of help. Of course, if someone poses a serious risk to society, they should be removed, but we should focus on helping them, not on punishing them. For those who aren't a danger to society, we should pursue other methods of punishment, such as community service or fines. That approach is not only more humane, it actually works. Norway's justice system, which centres on rehabilitation, has some of the best outcomes in the world. Yes, it has a higher upfront cost, but the money saved from keeping people out of prison more than makes up for it. Cost is what first pulled me into this topic. In 2023, 2 men in the UK were sentenced to 4 years each in prison for cutting down the Sycamore Gap tree, a famous landmark along the Hadrian Wall. Was it stupid? Yes. But from what I could tell, these men weren't a danger to society. Yet it's society that will bear the cost. The sentencing will cost the taxpayers £500,000. That doesn't seem proportionate to me, and it definitely wasn't cost effective. What if, instead of prison, they'd been sentenced to community service, and the money saved instead went to education on heritage in the local community? This could have acted as a teaching moment and helped the community rather than punish it. When we talk about justice, we need to ask, what are we actually trying to achieve? Vengeance or something better? I believe we can and should build a system that protects society and offers people a way back in. Thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and if you have any thoughts, please share them in the comments.